The story begins on a bright, sunny day in a city known for its deep history and impressive landmarks. The streets were packed with tourists, all eager to take pictures, explore, and immerse themselves in the beauty of the city. One such tourist, a young man in his late 20s, wandered around the area with a map in his hand. He was visiting from a faraway country, and the excitement of being in a place he had only seen in pictures was overwhelming. This tourist, let's call him John, had always enjoyed traveling. He loved seeing new places and meeting people from different cultures, but he wasn't the type to pay much attention to local customs or traditions. He was a bit too laid back for that. He had grown used to the relaxed atmosphere of his hometown, where people didn't pay much attention to the little things like manners or respect for the rules. So when he arrived at the city's famous square, he found himself amazed by its beauty, but also frustrated by the crowds. He had already spent hours walking around, and the constant hustle and bustle of other tourists was beginning to wear on his patience. As he passed by the royal palace, where a royal guard stood tall and still, John grew irritated by the slow-moving tourists blocking his path. To him, it seemed like no one could move quickly or get out of the way. In a moment of frustration, John did something completely out of character for someone in a foreign land. He took the empty soda can he had been holding and casually tossed it onto the ground at the royal guard's feet. John didn't think much of it. He was just annoyed, and the can needed to go somewhere. He thought that no one would really notice, and the guard, standing perfectly still, was hardly even paying attention. After all, he was just doing his job, right? But what John didn't realize was how wrong he was. The royal guard, dressed in his traditional uniform with a shiny breastplate and tall hat, stood like a statue. His job was to be completely still, no matter what happened around him. People had seen him countless times before. Tourists would take pictures with him, stare at his stern face, and sometimes even ask him silly questions. But what John didn't know was that the royal guards were highly respected figures, and their presence was taken very seriously by the locals. As John stood there, still oblivious to his mistake, he felt a strange silence fall over the area. The noise of the crowd seemed to fade as people began to look around, some even glancing over at him with disapproving eyes. John didn't know it yet, but he had just broken an unspoken rule of respect, and it was about to catch up with him. The crowd, which had once been noisy and distracted, suddenly felt tense. Eyes turned toward him, their gaze now sharp and aware. The unease in the air was palpable, but John simply shrugged it off. He didn't think it was a big deal. After all, it was just a piece of trash. Little did he know, this careless action would set off a chain of events that would change the course of his day and his life. As John continued to stand there, lost in the moment, he noticed that something was different. The usual hum of the crowd had slowed down, and it felt as if the world had quietly shifted. People around him were no longer just walking by, but instead they were looking at him. Some were shaking their heads, others whispered to each other. The looks they gave him were not the friendly glances he had gotten earlier in the day. These were stern, disapproving looks. John felt a little uneasy but tried to brush it off. After all, he was a tourist, and these people didn't know him. They didn't know that he wasn't trying to cause trouble. He glanced over at the royal guard, expecting him to remain still, just as he had been doing for hours. But this time, there was a subtle shift. The guard's posture seemed even more rigid than before, and although his face remained unreadable, something about his stance now radiated authority. John couldn't help but feel that the guard was aware of what he had done. The tourists around him began to murmur, and some even pointed at John. It was as if the entire square had suddenly turned its attention to him. John started to feel like the center of the universe in a way that made him uncomfortable. It wasn't just the curious stares. It was the silent judgment that weighed on him. He had made a mistake, and even though he didn't fully understand the seriousness of it, the atmosphere had shifted in a way that made him realize something was off. At first, John tried to smile it off, hoping that he could blend back into the crowd and forget about the moment. But as he took a step forward, he saw a few people shake their heads in disbelief. He could feel the heat of their disapproval, and it made him anxious. The last thing he wanted was to cause a scene, but the situation was starting to feel like it was getting out of his control. The once lively square now felt tense and awkward, and all John wanted was to escape the uncomfortable spotlight he had unknowingly stepped into. He quickly glanced around for an exit, hoping to slip away unnoticed. But that's when he noticed the royal guard begin to move. It wasn't an abrupt movement, but a deliberate shift that caught John off guard. The guard was stepping towards him, each stride measured and purposeful. The air around them seemed to still as the crowd took notice. John's heart began to race a little, and a sense of dread slowly crept up on him. He realized then that this wasn't just about a piece of trash on the ground. It was about something much deeper, something tied to the history and respect of the place he had entered. John's mind began to race. Should he apologize? Should he pretend nothing happened? He wasn't sure, but one thing became clear. The situation was no longer something he could ignore. The royal guard, whose job was to remain still and stoic, was now walking directly toward him. And John could feel the eyes of the entire square following his every move. The pressure was mounting, and John suddenly wished he could go back in time, before he had thrown the soda can to the ground, before the crowd had started to notice, before the silence took over. John's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the royal guard walk closer. The once calm atmosphere had transformed into something thick with tension. The guard's steady pace made it clear that this wasn't just a casual approach. It was purposeful, and that made John feel even more anxious. The people around him had fallen silent, and all eyes were fixed on the two of them. The weight of their attention made John feel like a child being scolded by a teacher, and he could almost feel the judgment in the air. He tried to act casual, hoping that if he didn't make a big deal out of it, maybe everyone else would let it go too. He shifted his weight, hoping his discomfort would go unnoticed. But the more he tried to ignore it, the more the situation seemed to grow. The crowd had stopped moving, and it felt like time had slowed down. John's face flushed as he realized that his small, thoughtless act had escalated into something far bigger than he had anticipated. As the royal guard stopped in front of him, John suddenly felt very small. The guard's imposing uniform, his sharp posture, and the authority that radiated from him made John feel out of place in this historic setting. The guard said nothing at first, but his presence spoke volumes. John, suddenly unsure of what to do, began to nervously shuffle his feet. His mind raced with thoughts of how he could fix this, how he could apologize, or whether he should just walk away. But the guard did not speak yet. Instead, he simply looked at John. The stillness of the moment was almost suffocating, and John began to realize that this wasn't going to be as easy as brushing off the incident. The seriousness of the guard's demeanor made it clear that what had happened wasn't just an innocent mistake. It was a violation of something important, something John hadn't even considered in his frustration. The crowd stood still, watching the scene unfold in front of them. John could feel their eyes on him, and the uncomfortable silence was almost too much to bear. It felt as though everyone was waiting for something to happen, and in that moment, he wished more than anything that he could just disappear. The weight of the situation was starting to sink in. He had been careless, thoughtless, and now he had to face the consequences of his actions. As the royal guard stood there, still as a statue, John couldn't help but feel regret creeping in. His initial annoyance had clouded his judgment, and now he was paying the price. He thought back to his earlier actions, how he had tossed the trash on the ground without thinking, how he had been frustrated by the crowd, how he had failed to see the significance of the royal guard's presence. And now, as he stood there under the watchful eyes of the crowd and the guard, he couldn't help but wish he could turn back time. But time didn't rewind. The royal guard's presence was unwavering, and the crowd waited for something to unfold. John, now fully aware of the gravity of the situation, felt a sense of helplessness. There was no escaping the moment, and all he could do was wait and see how the guard would respond. It was a humbling moment, and it was about to teach John a lesson he would never forget. The tension in the air was thick, and John's discomfort grew with each passing second. The royal guard remained unmoved, standing in front of him like an unyielding monument. John's mind raced with possibilities, unsure of what to expect. Was the guard going to say something? Was he going to be punished? The crowd continued to watch, some people looking at John with curious eyes, others with disapproving glares. It felt like the entire square had become a stage, and John was the unwilling actor, exposed under the bright lights. The silence was deafening. John's heart beat faster, and his palms began to sweat. Every movement he made felt exaggerated, like he was somehow drawing more attention to himself. The guard's gaze, steady and unwavering, never wavered from John. There was a sense of power in that stillness. The royal guard wasn't saying anything, but his presence alone was commanding enough to make John feel like he had done something much worse than he had. John had only thrown a can of soda to the ground, something that seemed so small and insignificant at the time. But in this place, with these people, it felt like he had broken an unspoken rule that was sacred. John opened his mouth, about to offer an apology, but before he could get a single word out, the royal guard took a step forward. The movement was slow and deliberate, like a giant in a dream, and it made John's stomach flip. The guard's footsteps echoed in the silence, his boots clicking against the cobblestone street. It wasn't an angry march, but it wasn't casual either. Every step was a reminder that John had overstepped in a place where respect was held in high regard. His earlier nonchalance now felt foolish, and the weight of the moment pressed on him harder than ever. "Follow me," the guard said, his voice calm yet firm, with an authority that was impossible to ignore. It wasn't a question or a request. It was a command. John was taken aback, his mind still trying to process everything that had just happened. His initial instinct was to refuse, to brush it off. But the way the guard spoke made it clear that this wasn't an option. The crowd's attention shifted from John to the guard, and in an instant, John realized that whatever was about to happen wasn't something he could escape. John hesitated for just a moment, his eyes darting around the square as though he might find an escape route. But the reality of the situation hit him. The crowd was still watching, waiting for something to happen. He wasn't about to embarrass himself further by trying to run. So, with a deep breath, he nodded and reluctantly followed the guard, his heart still pounding in his chest. The sound of his footsteps seemed too loud, too noticeable, and every eye in the square seemed to be locked onto him. As they walked away from the square, the crowd began to disperse, murmuring among themselves, still intrigued by what was unfolding. John tried to keep his composure, but every step felt heavier than the last. He had no idea where the guard was taking him. But one thing was certain: his carefree attitude had landed him in a situation he never could have imagined. The royal guard, with his unshakable presence and commanding tone, had led him into an unknown outcome, and John couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of his troubles. John followed the royal guard through the winding streets, each step heavier than the last. The city's grand buildings towered over them as they moved away from the square. And with each turn, John felt further removed from the place he had once thought of as a simple tourist spot. Now, it felt like a place where every action carried weight, and the people around him seemed to carry centuries of history with them. As they walked in silence, John tried to steady his thoughts. What was going to happen next? His mind spun with possibilities, none of which he liked. The guard, who had been so composed and still, was now leading him without saying another word. It felt as though the air had thickened around them, and even the faint noises of the city seemed to grow distant, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The further they walked, the more John felt like an outsider, a person who had made a grave mistake in a place where respect was sacred. The royal guard's presence was commanding. John could feel the authority in every step the guard took, yet there was no anger in his movements. It was just calm, calculated and unwavering. For a moment, John wondered if the guard was doing this to teach him a lesson, to make him realize how serious his actions had been. Perhaps it was an important lesson about respecting traditions, even if John hadn't fully understood their importance when he first arrived. As they rounded another corner, the guard led him to a building that looked different from the others. It was smaller, tucked away from the main roads, and there was an aura of quiet authority about it. It was clearly a place that held some kind of significance, but John had no idea what it was. The guard finally stopped and turned to face him. John felt a nervous lump in his throat, and he quickly glanced around, but the street was now deserted. It was just the two of them, and for the first time, John truly felt the weight of the situation. The royal guard was still as calm as ever, but John could sense the seriousness in his eyes. This wasn't going to be a simple reprimand. This was something that required an explanation, and John knew he was going to have to face whatever consequences awaited him. The guard looked at him for a moment, his expression unreadable. It was as though he was waiting for something, perhaps for John to say something. Anything that might show understanding. John swallowed hard, unsure of what to say. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. It wasn't that he didn't want to apologize. It was just that the weight of everything, the moment, the eyes of the crowd, the stillness of the guard, made him feel like his apology wouldn't be enough. The royal guard remained silent, but his presence alone made John feel like he was under a microscope. He couldn't escape this moment, and the tension seemed to grow with every second that passed. Finally, the guard spoke. "You didn't think about the importance of what you did you?" The guard said, his voice measured but firm. "There's a way to respect this place, a way to show that you understand its history and its meaning." John's stomach tightened, and for the first time since this all started, he felt the full weight of what he had done. He had thoughtlessly thrown that can, not realizing that even small actions could have a ripple effect. He had no idea how deeply ingrained the traditions of this place were, and how his actions had unknowingly challenged that tradition. The words the guard spoke weren't harsh, but they cut through John like a knife. He had made a mistake, one that he couldn't take back. As the silence stretched between them, John realized that he had more to learn than he had ever expected. The silence that followed the royal guard's words felt like an eternity to John. His mind was racing, trying to process the situation and what he had just heard. The weight of the guard's simple statement settled heavily on his shoulders. He hadn't expected this. He had expected maybe a scolding or a warning, but not a lesson in history, tradition, and respect. John glanced up at the guard, who was still standing tall, his posture as rigid and dignified as ever. It was as if he embodied the history of this place, and every word he spoke carried that weight. The guard's eyes weren't filled with anger or resentment, but there was something in his gaze that made John feel small. It wasn't hostility, but something deeper, something John couldn't quite put into words. It was as though the guard was trying to make him understand that this wasn't just about a momentary mistake. It was about something far more significant. After what felt like a long pause, the guard turned away and motioned for John to follow him. John hesitated for just a moment before stepping forward. He had no idea where they were headed, but at this point, he realized he didn't have a choice. The guard's command was clear, and there was a quiet authority in his every movement. John couldn't help but feel like he was being guided toward something, a place where he might learn the true meaning of what he had done. They walked through narrow, quiet streets, away from the busy center of the city. The further they went, the more the city seemed to quieten, as if the bustle of everyday life was being left behind. The paths grew narrower, and the buildings around them seemed older, steeped in history. John began to wonder if they were heading toward some hidden part of the city, a place that even most tourists never saw. His curiosity started to grow, though the unease in his chest didn't fade. He still wasn't sure what the guard was going to do next, and a part of him dreaded what was coming. Finally, they arrived at a small, unassuming building tucked away behind a high stone wall. The entrance was simple, with a wooden door that seemed out of place in the otherwise modern surroundings. The guard stopped in front of the door, turning to face John once more. The look in his eyes was still firm, but there was a hint of something else, something like understanding, or maybe just patience. "This is where things are dealt with," the guard said, his voice low but carrying the weight of the moment. "You will understand soon." John felt his throat tighten, and though he had no idea what was going to happen next, he couldn't shake the feeling that this place held more significance than he could grasp. He stood there for a moment, unsure whether to ask questions or wait. But as the guard pushed open the door and gestured for him to enter, John stepped inside. What he saw inside was not what he had expected. The room was simple, but there were displays of artifacts and historical pieces that lined the walls. The air felt different here, thick with the sense of tradition, of reverence for what had come before. There were paintings, sculptures, and even old uniforms displayed as if to remind anyone who entered of the weight of the past. The atmosphere was solemn, and John immediately felt out of place in this quiet, sacred space. The royal guard closed the door behind him, and for a moment, John stood alone in the room, taking in the significance of what surrounded him. This wasn't just about his mistake anymore. It was about understanding a place, a culture, and its values. It was about realizing that even small actions had the power to affect the greater whole. The guard turned to John, his expression softer now, though still firm. "This place represents the heart of the city, its history, and its people. The traditions you see here are not just relics of the past. They are alive, and they are to be respected." John nodded slowly, his earlier sense of discomfort now mixed with a deep sense of respect. He had entered this city with no knowledge of what it stood for, but now, as he looked around at the artifacts that filled the room, he began to understand. This place wasn't just a tourist destination. It was a living, breathing testament to something greater, something that he had been blind to before. The guard continued, "Your actions, though small, reflect how we all carry the weight of this place. The respect we show is not just for the guards or the buildings, but for the traditions that shape us. And sometimes, understanding that takes more than just seeing. It takes feeling." John's throat tightened, and for the first time, he realized that the lesson he was learning was about more than just being polite. It was about understanding the deeper meaning of respect. Respect for history, for people, and for the spaces we occupy. He had made a mistake, but in that moment, John stood in the room, feeling the weight of the guard's words pressing down on him. The stillness around him made him feel even more aware of his own presence. He wasn't just in a building full of historical artifacts anymore. He was in a place where meaning lived, where actions had consequences beyond the immediate moment. His earlier carefree attitude felt like a distant memory now, replaced by a newfound understanding of respect and the importance of his own actions. The royal guard stood by the door, watching John closely but saying nothing for a moment. The silence was almost overwhelming, and John felt a need to say something, to somehow make things right. But the guard's calm demeanor and the sacredness of the room kept him from speaking too hastily. It was as though the room itself was guiding him toward a deeper understanding. Finally, John broke the silence. "I didn't know. I didn't realize it was such a big deal," he said quietly, his voice full of regret. It was the first time he had acknowledged just how careless he had been, and the weight of that realization seemed to hang in the air. The guard gave him a slight nod, as if acknowledging the truth in John's words, but he didn't respond immediately. Instead, he gestured toward the room around them. "You see these artifacts?" the guard asked, his voice soft, but still carrying the strength of his position. "These are not just old objects. They are symbols of what this city has stood for generations. They are reminders of the people who built this place, who fought to protect it, and who lived by the traditions that make it what it is today. Every single piece here is a part of something greater than any one of us." John nodded, his eyes drifting over the items displayed in the room. He had noticed them before, but they had seemed like simple relics, old, forgotten pieces of history that had no immediate connection to his life. But now, as he took in the details of each artifact, they seemed to pulse with meaning. The paintings on the walls, the ancient weapons, the faded uniforms, they all told a story. They were pieces of a much larger narrative, and each one was important. The guard continued, "What you did today wasn't just an act of disrespect toward a person. It was an act that affected the way people see the values of this place. It's not about the can you threw on the ground. It's about the message it sends. The way we treat our surroundings, the way we treat each other, shows what we value. And that, in turn, shows who we are." John felt a wave of understanding wash over him. It wasn't just about the action. It was about the respect that every action should carry. He had been too quick to dismiss the significance of his surroundings, too eager to let his frustration take over. But now, he saw how even the smallest actions could contribute to or undermine the values of a place. His actions mattered. "I'm sorry," John said, this time with more sincerity in his voice. "I didn't mean to disrespect anything or anyone. I didn't understand how important it was, but now I do. I won't forget this." The guard regarded him quietly for a moment, then nodded once more, this time with a hint of approval in his expression. It wasn't an easy apology, and John could tell that the guard didn't expect perfection. What mattered was that John understood the lesson, and that he was willing to learn from it. "Everyone makes mistakes," the guard said, his voice softer now. "The key is recognizing them and choosing to do better. You've taken the first step. The rest is up to you." John felt a sense of relief, but it was a different kind of relief than he had expected. It wasn't about escaping punishment or getting out of a tight spot. It was about understanding a truth that he hadn't fully grasped before. In that quiet room, surrounded by the history and culture of a place he had once taken for granted, John realized that the journey wasn't just about seeing the sights. It was about learning the lessons that came with each moment, and that true respect wasn't just for the things we can see. It was for the things we might not even notice until we take a closer look. As he stood there, taking in the weight of everything the guard had shared, John knew that this experience would stay with him forever. He had been taught not just how to respect a city or its traditions, but how to respect the deeper meaning of every action he took from that point forward. The road ahead was long, but this moment had set him on a path that would change the way he saw the world. As John stood in the quiet room, the weight of the guard's words continued to settle in. He could feel that he had been changed in some way, but it wasn't until he left that room and stepped back into the world outside that he truly began to understand just how much. The air seemed different now, and as he walked through the city's streets, the same buildings and people that had once seemed so familiar now felt completely new to him. His perspective had shifted, and he began to see the deeper meanings behind the things he had once taken for granted. The guard had given him a lesson in respect, but it wasn't just about respecting the royal traditions of the city. It was about respecting everything around him. It was about seeing the value in places, people, and customs, even when they weren't immediately obvious. The smallest actions, the quietest moments, could have far-reaching effects. John had learned that his careless behavior, though seemingly harmless, had the potential to disrupt the delicate balance of things. Walking through the city, John couldn't help but think about all the tourists he had seen earlier that day. People who, like him, had come to witness the beauty of the place. But now, he understood that it wasn't just about sightseeing or taking pictures. It was about understanding and appreciating the history that had shaped this place, the people who had lived and worked here, and the deep respect they held for their traditions. It was about acknowledging that when we visit somewhere, we don't just pass through. We become a part of the story, even if it's just for a short time. As John made his way back to the square, he noticed the royal guard standing there once more, as still and unwavering as ever. He had learned so much from their encounter, but now he was seeing it all in a new light. The guard wasn't just standing there for show. He was a symbol of something much greater. The way he stood, silent and composed, was a reflection of the city's history, its values, and the respect it demanded. John felt a surge of gratitude toward the guard. He had thoughtlessly crossed a line earlier, but in the end, the guard had not only shown him his mistake, but had also opened his eyes to something much bigger than himself. John now understood that respect wasn't just about following rules. It was about recognizing the significance of the places we go, the people we meet, and the actions we take. Later that day, John found a quiet spot in the city to sit and reflect. He took a deep breath and realized that the experience had been a turning point for him. It wasn't just about apologizing or making amends. It was about growing and learning from his mistakes. He could already feel the change in himself. From that point forward, he promised himself that he would approach each new place, each new experience, with more care and thoughtfulness. He would try to see the world not just with his eyes, but with an understanding heart. When John finally left the city a few days later, he carried with him the lessons he had learned. He didn't just leave with memories of the landmarks or the history he had seen. He left with a deeper appreciation for the traditions that had shaped the city and for the importance of respecting the cultures we encounter in our travels. The Royal Guard's lesson had been more than just a correction. It had been a gift. As John boarded his plane, he knew that the experience would stay with him for the rest of his life. It wasn't about one mistake. It was about how we choose to learn from those mistakes and how we use those lessons to become better versions of ourselves. He had started this journey as a tourist, but he was leaving as someone who now understood the true value of respect. And that, he realized, was something that would stay with him no matter where he went.